If you're new to our channel, we'd love to have you join our little community. Just hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications. We promise it will be worth your while.
Jane took Michael back into the parlor and modestly commended him on his behavior. She sipped at a cordial as she sat expansively on the love seat opposite him. "I have come to a decision, Michael, and I felt it important you hear it tonight. You recall I told you yesterday that I would wait until Friday to see if I wished to continue with your training? I confess the way that you have behaved, and especially that outburst today, had led me to a decision to decline this task." He squirmed a little, anticipating something that was likely to be both auspicious and dreadful at once. "You were very nearly exemplary this evening, and you redeemed yourself. I have decided to give it a try. Does this mean I will have to wear these clothes? If you wish to stay here, yes. It is part of the course." He grew depressed again, realizing that his hopes of freedom on Friday were dashed. He was equally chagrined that this so-called petticoating was to continue. He did not have great reservations about staying here, but it could be done without this sissy bullshit that he detested. "You know, Aunt Jane," he ventured, "I don't know if my mother would approve of any of this. Nor the school. I'd bet, and you'd tell them? Is that it, Michael? You'd tell them about this wicked woman who made you dress like a little girl and primp and preen and curtsy and all that?" He nodded, and this gesture drew a wry smile to her lips. She stared at him a moment, sipped at the cordial, and walked to the desk. "I think not," he heard her say as he watched her pick up an envelope and return to the settee, placing the envelope on the coffee table between them. "You see, your mother already knows. That is precisely why she sent you. I'll admit it was a last resort, but your mother is perfectly aware that her sweet little boy is sitting here in skirts. She and I spoke of it before you ever arrived." He gulped, astonished that his mother would allow this. "As for the school, I would suggest that that is not an admission you'd make to them or to anyone else. How embarrassing it would be to even admit that you had been in dresses. On the other hand, it might be a revelation I'd make if I don't get your continued cooperation. Take a look at that," indicating the envelope. He picked up its bulk and opened a flap. His hand drew out a sheaf of photographs, and it began to tremble as he saw the first one. In vivid color was Michael in various costumes, being made up and wielding cosmetic applicators on himself. There were shots of him in curlers and with Maria fixing ribbons in the finished mass of curls. All in all, there were over 24 pictures, which appalled him. "Give some thought tonight, Michael, of the effect those darling photos would have on the other boys you go to school with. If you don't want to be totally humiliated, I'd suggest you keep your threats to yourself. I doubt that even if I can get you reinstated at St. Andrews, you'd want to return under the cloud of being the campus sissy. Think well on that." Jane dismissed him at that point, sending him back to his room. Michael later lay in the dark room and stared at the canopy. He had undressed and taken a bath. When he hung the dress in the closet, he was somewhat surprised to see that the blouse and slacks were still there. What did that mean? He had opted for tailored pajamas rather than a feminine gown, but the smooth silkiness of the peach-colored coat and trousers, with the little bows and appliques, were a burlesque parody of his intention to wear something more masculine. He was still a sissy and a girl. His room, and now, with photographic proof of his dalliance in these girlish pursuits, Jane had yet another lever to wrest his submission. He turned off the light and sank into deeper despondency as he fell asleep. In the frenzied days that followed through the weekend and into Monday, Michael was exposed to more femininity and girlish activity than he had ever imagined possible. The curiosities, sights, and smells of living a girl's life were thrust on him at a dizzying pace. There were mannerisms and postures to assimilate. He practiced for hours with rollers and makeup, his arms tiring from the unfamiliar reach required to roll the wands into his hair. He learned about colors and combinations in clothes, shoes, and accessories. He practiced curtsies, polite phraseology and locutions that sounded a feat to his male ear, adjectives that he would have shunned at all costs as a boy began to seep into his speech. Indeed, speech and mannerisms seemed the hallmarks. Inflection conveyed more than anything, Jane tutored, and he chafed as he mimicked the exaggerated intonations she prompted. He practiced gestures and walking and light hints of poise, like tidying his hair in the right way to examine his face and dresses in a mirror. He was ceaselessly being fussed over and busying himself with dainty little detail. He spent what seemed hours perfecting the application of a myriad of colors to his face, his nails. He submerged himself in bubbly baths, shaved practically invisible hairs from his legs and arms. It was a seemingly perpetual routine that started early in the day and ran till late at night, not only learning a facile walk in pumps, but becoming nimble at daintily swaying an ankle while balanced on the other foot. The girlish positioning of the hands on hips as opposed to the arms akimbo stance of a man, crossing the legs just right when sitting, exposing just the right amount of leg beneath the hem of the skirt, care in both sitting and rising from a chair, so that the movement flowed gracefully and smoothly, the subtle and vain fluff of the hair that primped it in place. A winsome manner of correcting makeup when others were watching so that the action seemed less pragmatic than attractive. All of these subtleties had eluded him when, as a boy, he watched girls. There was so much to learn and master. He submitted to this drill grudgingly, maintaining an outward facade of equanimity about it, but inwardly austere with emotions. He detested the role he had to play, especially when something he did or the way he looked prompted a comment from Marie or Beth or Jane which emphasized his growing grasp of girlish ways. Some of it, to be sure, had become tolerable because of its familiarity. He confessed to himself an enjoyment derived from the touch of the smooth fabrics on the most sensitive parts of his body. He had to admit that when he viewed the girl in the mirror as some detached persona which coexisted with him, it was a very pretty girl. The fact was, he had to admit to himself, he did present the image of a pretty girl. This realization caused him great consternation. He began to think of himself as a sissy. If he did these things, and evinced an occasional pleasure in doing it and what he saw accomplished, what did that make him? The thoughts troubled him, and he wondered if there were not some subtle internal change taking place. He hoped not, for he knew this must all come to an end, and he had no desire for these events to seep into his return to a male world. Ironically, it was this dualism that preserved his equanimity and kept his panic in check. He could partially detach his boyhood from the repulsive things being done to him and simply go along. That submerged self still felt the distress of every sissy thing he was made to experience, and he was demeaned by the results these women forced upon him. Yet another part of him puzzlingly identified with the girl in the mirror and strived to perfect the right characteristics to project her femininity. This constant seesaw and the alternative and conflicting emotions made him queasy and often disgusted with himself. A more profound torture seemed unimaginable. Fear motivated him most, even fear of the reaction of Beth, Marie, or Jane to what he did or failed to do. When he did his makeup just so, appeared before them with curls in place and dainty girlish garb accurate in every detail, He felt abject embarrassment. Well, if he were chastised for a mistake or called a sissy for doing it well, that chagrin heightened. He comprehended that even when he made a passable girlish gesture or speech, his competence led to the inevitable conclusion that he was being feminized as a boy, being constrained to act as a girl. He was most grateful that at least these feminizing activities took place within the sanctuary of the house. He dreaded going outdoors like this, but Beth had warned him that such trips were to take place in the near future. He panicked each time he thought about it, and hoped nothing would go awry as it had on his last outing. The realization that he could conceivably deceive outsiders, if he handled himself appropriately, was the singular motivation in absorbing all the elements of this effeminate pantomime. On the one hand, he worried about discovery, and yet he strongly sensed that if he acted the perfect girl, he would pass. Yet in so doing, he did injury to his male persona. It was a cycling paradox, and so the prospect of being made to go out again constantly distressed him with its devastating possibilities of shame and embarrassment. Did the trapped animal feel like this? He wondered. He was made to do things that transcended mere clothing or adornment. Jane had sat him down and suggested that some exposure to dance might improve his grace and movement. Beth was to be his preliminary instructor in this area, though it was conceded by both Jane and Beth that she was merely passing on the lessons she had learned at her own dancing class, and that the practice would be very elementary. Beth led him to a chamber that had once been a medium-sized ballroom. Here she taught him the elements of dance. He submitted to donning leotards, tights and a short dance skirt, and tap shoes that were like the Mary Jane's except that they tied at his ankles with a black satin bow. After several hours of repetitive drill, he had begun to master the heel, toe, and shuffle that were the elements of tap dancing. Beth was as diligent in imparting tips on the proper carriage of the arms in a graceful style as she was in teaching the syncopating cadence of the metal taps on the wooden floor. At one point he saw Jane surveying the duo from the doorway and felt a moment of self-consciousness. He was less disconcerted doing these foolish little steps and skips with Beth alone, but the adult presence rankled him. Ballet steps, too, were practiced, and Jane insisted that a tall-skirted costume was a necessary ingredient of this routine. He felt really silly assuming the flamboyant poses of that style, especially perfecting the graceful stance that Beth seemed to have mastered. He frequently felt a dreamlike detachment from his true self, as though he were dreaming and all of this would go away when he awoke. But, in truth, he woke each morning in that same fragile room, reorienting himself to its strange, but ever more familiar atmosphere. And each morning when he woke, the turgidness of his erection grazed the sheer material of his gown, and he savored the sensations it sent through him. One morning he succumbed to the urgency and, with very little effort, found release. In retrospect, that event was unlike any other solitary adolescent autoeroticism he'd engaged in. It was as if the sensuous surroundings and titillating feel of the garments themselves conveyed a certain erotica, to the extent that he fantasized about a suggestive figure during the act. He kept seeing the petite reflection of himself he had seen in the mirror. Jane watched the events unfold with satisfaction, seeing the transformation develop superbly. Michael was assimilating a truly feminine air. Jane knew instinctively that the boy's repugnance of this business was undiminished, but he had begun to display somewhat less resistance to it. Indeed, she had caught him more than once preening in the mirror or fingering the ruffled edge of the dress. She knew that this abandon was, in part, due to the sanctuary that the house itself afforded, a security she would shatter later this week, but each day brought him closer to total submission to the control of flounces and frills. Perhaps if Michael knew the exhaustive plans that Jane had been making, that were sure to affect him, he would have been less hopeful and sanguine about what might happen to him this week. On Monday morning, as she sat alone drinking her coffee on the veranda, she was musing and making notes while scanning the local paper. She'd been mildly pleased by the change in attitude she had witnessed in Michael these last 3 days, and felt another 2 days of the same exercises would be in order. But he was growing altogether too comfortable in these surroundings. Not that he was accepting any of it, but the resignation he evinced needed some additional challenge. He needed to be jarred out the complacency and security that the house gave him. The creation of new tensions was indispensable principle of his development. To this end, she was making a list. She had planned hair appointments for them both, and she had to call Carolyn or Sandra to set the stage for that. She picked up the phone and reached Carolyn, who expressed eager expectation at the arrival of a new neophyte for them to work on. In her excitement, it was she who suggested Wednesday. For that morning, she had a charm class scheduled. Carolyn conducted classes for young girls in hair care and makeup. A group was coming in on Wednesday morning, and Carolyn suggested that Michael could be made to act as the model for her lecture. Jane thought this a capital idea, and the date was set. Checking that item off her list, Jane scanned the paper for the weekly advertisements. Several sales at shops she liked caught her eye, and a note was made of these as well. Jane next dialed Edith White and caught her at home. Michelle, Jane told her friend, would, in fact, be staying a while after all, and both girls would be available to participate in Edith's festivities. Edith was thrilled. She told Jane that the costumes for the girls were available at Milady's closet in town, and since the only requirement was that the girls sit poised and pretty on the float in the parade, she left it to Jane to select the appropriate costume. Jane added another item to Wednesday's agenda. In less than half an hour, she had scheduled the Wednesday activities, including lunch at the Heritage Inn. Michael would encounter the full range of a girl's day on the town. Her next call was to Margaret Warden, who ran the dance studio that Beth attended. Jane told her she had another young girl staying with her for the summer and thought that a few lessons in tap and ballet would be worthwhile. Margaret, of course, sensing the tuition income, agreed. Jane allowed as how this young lady was inexperienced and slightly awkward, but with a dance instructor's overstatement, Jane was assured that even a total neophyte could be graceful in just weeks. Jane penciled in Thursday for the first lesson. After another item in the paper caught her eye. It was a call for auditions at a local children's theater. Jane knew the people who ran the program and decided to call them as well. Another element of fine arts would both do Michael good and expose him to yet another regretful situation. It was a full schedule, fraught with numerous exposures of her young beruffled boy to people and places that would prove disquieting to him. The list provided ample appointments for her to demand his involvement in these distressing locals. Jane was sure that she could think of 1 or 2 items to add to the list that might even escalate that uneasiness. The day whose arrival Michael had been dreading most turned out to be Wednesday. Jane had announced the night before that he and Beth would be going into town with her for some shopping and errands. Beth had forewarned him of the upcoming trip to Kingston. But she was reticent and sketchy about the details. And when Michael had expressed anxiety about another trip to town, Beth had offered the reassurance that when he was completely dressed as a girl and meticulously done up, He was very convincing. It was simply a matter of remembering all that he had been taught and not betraying a single sign of being a boy. Despite that encouragement, the memory of his last appalling trip into town plagued him, and he expected the worst on this next venture. They were all up early on Wednesday morning and had finished breakfast before 8:30. Jane instructed Michael to shower and get dressed. He was to put on the panties and bra that she had shown him the preceding evening, garters and hose, and a full slip with a single net layer between two of taffetas. She had selected a short, slightly puffed-sleeved, mauve polyester rayon dress, its skirt modestly billowing out over the petticoat, and adorned with a gray ribbon sash. The dress suggested maturity, but at the same time the fullness of the skirt, its narrow lace trim, and the cut of the sleeves suggested a design more suited to a child. He was to simply brush his hair and apply a minimal touch of makeup. Michael went to his room solemnly. The cold feeling of dread he felt was not even dissipated by the warm jets of the shower. He dried off and returned to the hushed blue shadows of his room and selected in turn each item of lingerie. The superfluous bra produced satiny busts over his own male nipples, while it closed easily in front, although he had by now nearly mastered the technique to fasten nearly every type of lingerie without Marie's help. He tugged on the panties, sensing again their tight smoothness on his buttocks and groin, and slipped the hose up snugly and affixed their tops to the 4 garter straps that dangled from the belt around his waist. As he donned the lacy underwear, he felt the familiar butterflies in his stomach. The tingling stricture of the nylons brought a different coolness to his smooth legs. He slid the slip down over himself, and it encased his body with a soft caress. The dress was the usual problem, its zipper in the back out of reach. With some contortion, he was able to slide the zipper to its top, and finally managed to clasp the tiny hook at the top. He stepped into the 2-inch pumps and sat at the vanity to brush his hair and inserted the barrettes as he had been taught at each temple. He brushed a light blush over his cheeks and along his chin line and across the brow. A light touch of mascara was followed with a touch of pale lipstick. He did not look nearly as eye-catching as he had on other occasions, but it seemed to suffice. Ironically, as he scrutinized his appearance further, he thought of last week when he was searching for traces of makeup to diminish all traces. Now the situation was reversed, and after some consideration, Michael frowned at what he saw as not projecting enough femininity. He decided that a little more color would be prudent today, dressed as he was in these girlish trappings. Selecting a brighter shade of cosmetics, he reapplied color to cheeks and lip, and as an afterthought, he added a small strand of pearls and a bracelet. Michael picked up his small purse and draped its handle over his left wrist as Jane had instructed. He paused in front of the full-length mirror to view his image and was torn between his admiration for the pretty reflection and the revulsion he felt at the acknowledgement that she was he. Michael got the usual laurels about his prettiness when he arrived downstairs, abashedly brushing them aside with a muted thank you. He steeled himself to departing the security of the house and got into the car. As the trio approached their first stop, Michael recoiled in shock. His hesitation was momentary, however, as Jane quickly realized his reluctance and firmly grasped his hand. She brooked no unwillingness on his part as they neared the door. "Let's not have any boyish nonsense now, Michelle," she instructed. "Remember, if you act completely and entirely as the charming young lady you appear to be, no one need be the wiser. On the other hand, if you do not, you will either be found out, or I may simply trumpet the fact you are a boy who loves dressing up." like a sissy. Michael winced at her use of the feminine Michelle, and the forewarning of misery if he was exposed. But he realized the sense in her advice, even if it was worded in her usual, gratuitous manner. He was so preoccupied with his own concerns that he failed to realize that Beth too seemed subdued with the thought of spending several hours in this environment. They walked into the Marisha chalet, and Michael's mind reeled with disquiet as he looked about the chic beauty salon. The success of the establishment was evident by the large number of patrons that were there even at this early hour. Michael saw both women and men having their hair done in this setting, especially when he contemplated what well might be coming, made him inwardly shudder. They were greeted by someone to whom he was introduced as Carolyn, one of the owners. She indicated that she would be doing Beth and that Sandra would take care of Michelle. When she looked at him, Michael could have sworn there was a wry, knowing smirk on her face. She led him to the shampoo basin. The shampoo girl was the second person he met, a pretty lass of 17 or 18 named Shelley. She worked silently, placing a shiny cape around him, fastening it at the neck and draping its broad folds around him. She turned the chair around and gently lowered his nape to the edge of the basin, mixing the water to proper temperature, wetting and then lathering his hair. After a repeat of this, she wrapped a towel around his head, returned the chair to its upright position, and led him over to the place where the operators' booths were located. The booths were slight indentations into the wall. They were not fully separated from either the adjacent stations, nor were they invisible from the rest of the shop. He saw that Beth was being worked on in the adjacent booth, and on his other side, the cubicle was vacant. He hoped it stayed that way. Sandra came over, told him her name half-heartedly, and started to work without other comment. Michael was content to bear this burden without conversation, and so invited none. She removed the towel and began combing through the wet strands of hair, aligning them and separating them into sectors around his scalp with pins that left her field of work free. She drew wide strands through her fingers, and with scissors, she clipped only a small snip from the end of each strand. Again and again she repeated this, scrutinizing the progress in the mirror, cutting more or less here and there, styling as she went. This aspect was not remarkably unlike any haircut he had ever received in a store such as this. Perhaps he was most surprised by the small amount of hair her snips removed, and the fact that her next act was to use a razor to shave parts of his hairline that had never felt a razor before. She worked silently and briskly. When she was finished, she shook out the clipped hair from the cape and replaced the shawl-like garment over him. She next wheeled a circular tiered tray alongside his chair. Each tier held a myriad of pastel-colored rollers of varying diameters. She had just begun to select the implements necessary to give Michael his first permanent wave when she leaned over and whispered in his ear, "So you are Jane's latest sissy in residence." Her words electrified him, and he turned ashen in the mirror. Involuntarily, he started to turn in her direction, but she pressed his shoulders down as she continued, "Calm down, sweetness, or you'll mess up my work. And I just hate that. The last time that happened, I told everyone in the place I had a sweet little femmy boy here getting his hair nice and curled up. It did not take much, at this point, to make him speechless. He glanced around the room with his peripheral vision through the images in the glass, searching for someone who might have heard what she said. No one seemed to have noticed. Sandra watched his eyes darting fearfully about the room and smiled. "I'm glad you learned quickly, Honorable Now Cutie. You just act as sweet as you look, and maybe you and I won't have any problems," she teased. Her words had jolted him, and he settled back into the chair, paralyzed with fear and a newfound submission to this frightening woman. Michael tried to slow his breathing while Sandra asked Caroline over to his chair. She joined them shortly with a large magazine, like a catalog. Caroline leaned over the motionless boy and spread the book out on his lap. "Here, Michael," she said in a low voice, which she immediately corrected with a gleam in her eye. "I mean, Michelle, why don't you look through here and tell us which style you'd like for your permanent?" Michael mutely gazed at the first page, horrified at both the word permanent and the picture confronting him. The girl in the photo had a glorious head of full, luscious blonde curls, cascading beyond her shoulders, the bangs styled and fluffed with mousse. He realized that his hair was thankfully too short for such a style, but was petrified at what the next page might hold. His silent stare continued for several moments, until Sandra leaned over as if to work on his hair near the right ear. But instead, she grasped the lobe of the ear and pinched it fiercely, whispering, "Real girls like to do this, Michelle. So unless you want the people here to know you're a boy in a dress," she hissed, "you better start to show some girlish enthusiasm. I know you have a girl hiding inside you," she added, her voice now full of teasing enthusiasm. "So let's see her enjoying her trip to the beauty parlor." Michael winced at the pressure she applied to his ear, no less than at her comments, but realized he was at a make or break moment in his time in skirts, and capitulated. He flipped the page, and without even thinking, turned his head towards Sandra and said, "Ugh, isn't this one simply wonderful? Do you think I could wear it?" Caroline grinned at the forced, yet to the public's eye and ear, apparently genuine, feminine query from him. Michael blushed and turned his eyes down, and for the first time saw the style he had referred to. It was worse than the first, if for no other reason, because his hair was short enough for the style. The girl's hair was nearly shoulder length, fashioned in tighter curls, yet still with a very full shape. The bangs were again left uncurled, to allow for their arrangement into a variety of shapes, as the upswept style on the model clearly demonstrated. The final touch was a lace ribbon, wrapped from the back of the neck, up behind the ears, and tied in a large bow towards the right side of the head. The ribbon caused the hair to fluff out even further than it might have fallen naturally. Michael was ready to turn the page, hoping to find something less stylized, when Caroline took the book off his lap. "A perfect choice, Michelle," she said as she closed the book and turned to walk away. Looking over her shoulder at him, she loudly added, "I'm sure everyone here will want to see how it turns out." He cringed inwardly at her words, but managed to smile, afraid that to do otherwise would risk exposure. Sandra then began her work. She stroked her comb again through his hair, once more isolating sectors and clipping them aside. Her actions now were slower and more deliberate. She wetted his hair with a solution whose pungent aroma matched that which permeated the shop and which he had noticed when he came in. The liquid ran away from his hairline in places, and she sopped it with the towel. For a moment, the parts of his face that it touched burned slightly, but this passed. As he watched her in the mirror, he saw that she isolated a strand of hair, held it with one hand as she took a tissue and smoothed it down the end of the strand. Holding this wrapped tress tautly in her fingers, she selected one of the colored rollers and spooled the lock of hair around it, drawing it up tight to his scalp and fastening the elastic device that held it in place. Though she was meticulous and fastidious with each curl she fashioned, it seemed only a short time before she had completed the top of his head and was working down the back. He was sitting in the chair silently when she softly spoke again. "You're not the first little boy we've prettied up in this place. and I suspect you'll be sent back for more. So just keep calm. Piss me off, though, and I'll let that guy down on the end. Know that I have a little boy here who plays like he is a girl. Or maybe that little girl over there. I'll bet she'd want to take you home to play dress up. How you like that, pretty little Michelle? A renewed alarm surged through him, and he fought to retain composure. He was cornered. He could not bolt, and yet he had to suffer the abuse this woman seemed to enjoy heaping on him. He sat stunned as she relentlessly continued. You have such nice hair, Michelle, rolling another strand into the tangle of curlers that adorned his head. Nice golden hair. After I'm finished, you'll be amazed at what I have done. And these curls won't go away. They are permanent and will stay and stay. Her voice was subdued and almost husky. Under other circumstances, and with different dialogue, it might have been seductive. Her taunting whisper continued as she worked. After I'm done, Carolyn has something especially wonderful for you. You'll be a perfect little doll when we're through with you. He trembled with a mix of expectation and dread. We are going to do a real job on you today. Jane said, give him the works. We're going to give you the works. Another wand, another strand affixed itself to his scalp. So far, I think, the amateurs have had you. Wait and see what the pros can do to you. He had often sat in a hairstylist's chair and listened to the idle banter they made. Small talk that seldom evoked anything more than a perfunctory reply. This dialogue was like getting an obscene phone call, a tete-a-tete, which communicated flutters of anxiety through his every fiber. He longed to be out of this place. The pointed, teasing barbs continued as he was forced to watch in the mirror as she performed these most feminine procedures on him. He prayed fervently that no one else could hear her murmuring derision. He prayed even harder that she would not suddenly blurt out some revelation to this whole crowd. She finished rolling up his hair, and he saw a profusion of pastel pink and blue curlers doing their work on his hair. Some new solution was applied, its pungent odor a stronger version of what he had smelled on first coming in here. She set the clock for 45 minutes, then moved a table beside the chair and sat down. She seized his hand and with a saturated cotton ball, removed all trace of polish from each nail. Shaping each in turn with an emery board, she applied nearly 5 layers of clear polish to each finger. Beth was visible in the mirror, seated beneath the hood of a hairdryer, looking a little melancholy, he thought, as she idly turned the pages of a magazine. Regardless of what Sandra said about feminine enthusiasm, Beth wasn't showing much more than boredom, and something else he couldn't quite put his finger on.